Marcus Johnson stood beneath the wing of an $80 million jet. He had spent 23 sleepless days bringing back from ruin, his shirt stained with grease, his hands still trembling slightly from exhaustion. He had not allowed himself to feel until this exact moment. When the work was finally done, the men in the boardroom barely looked up from their coffee. "You are just a contractor," the chief executive said, a flat smile pulling at his mouth. The kind of smile men wear when they believe they are getting away with something. "We owe you nothing." Marcus said nothing back. He peeled off his work gloves one finger at a time, set them on the table like a closing statement, and walked out into the morning light without giving anyone in that room the satisfaction of an argument. 2 days later, the airport ground to a halt. The first pilot refused to fly the plane. Then a second refused. Then an entire fleet of captains stood in the gate area and would not move, because every one of them had just learned a truth that made the idea of taking that aircraft into the sky unthinkable, a truth that no press release and no corporate reassurance could undo. Marcus Johnson was 42 years old, a former aviation engineer who had spent 11 years in uniform before trading a base hangar for a quiet, independent life most people never noticed and never asked about. He drove a truck with more rust than paint, the kind of vehicle that announced nothing and promised nothing, which suited him fine, since he had never cared much for appearances. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in steady rotation, washed and folded the same way every week, a small ritual of order in a life otherwise governed by the unpredictable demands of broken machines. He had a daughter named Olivia, 8 years old, sharp-eyed and curious, who thought her father's job was fixing airplanes the way other dads fixed. Sinks, ordinary, unremarkable, a thing you did quietly, and then came home for dinner, smelling faintly of jet fuel and metal shavings. In the small, insulated world of aviation engineering, however, Marcus Johnson's name carried a very different kind of weight. Older mechanics spoke of him the way younger ones spoke of legends. A man who could read a stress fracture the way other people read a sentence, who could listen to an engine cycle and tell you, before any diagnostic tool confirmed it, exactly where the trouble lived. He never sought a stage. He never gave interviews, never posted his work anywhere for strangers to admire, never explained himself to people who had not earned an explanation. He simply showed up, fixed what was broken, collected what he was owed, and disappeared again into the next contract, the next hangar, the next problem nobody else wanted to touch. Sky Vista Airlines was not a small operation, and it was not used to being humbled by anything, least of all by mechanical failure. The trouble started with a single regional jet, an aircraft worth more money than most people would earn across 3 lifetimes combined, that suffered a catastrophic technical failure during what should have been a routine inspection cycle. What followed made things worse. Engineer after engineer, firm after firm, looked at the damage and delivered some version of the same verdict. The airframe was compromised beyond any reasonable hope of repair. Write it off. Scrap it. Take the insurance money and move forward before the cost of trying climbed any higher than it already had. Some of these experts charged staggering consulting fees simply to deliver that single sentence of bad news, walking the length of the fuselage once, shaking their heads, and presenting an invoice on their way out the door. The aircraft sat grounded in a hangar on the edge of the airport for weeks, a monument to expensive failure, while insurance adjusters circled and executives argued behind closed doors about how to spin the loss for shareholders who were already asking uncomfortable questions. Richard Collins, the chief executive of Sky Vista, did not believe in miracles, and he certainly did not believe one would arrive in the form of an independent contractor nobody on his executive staff had ever heard of. He had built his career on certainty, on numbers that behaved predictably, on decisions that could be defended in front of a board with charts and projections. The idea of trusting a single unknown man with an $80 million problem offended something deep in his professional instincts. Sandra Hall, the chief financial officer, was the one who finally pushed the idea forward, not out of faith in Marcus specifically, but out of plain desperation, because every other option on the table cost considerably more than hiring one stubborn, independent engineer for a fraction of what a major aerospace repair firm would demand. They brought Marcus in quietly, almost apologetically, the way executives bring in a last resort they are privately embarrassed to admit they needed, hoping nobody important would notice the arrangement until after it either succeeded or failed. The first morning Marcus walked into that hangar, the reception told him everything he needed to know about how this assignment was going to unfold. A cluster of younger engineers, sharp creased uniforms under their coveralls, expensive watches catching the overhead lights, watched him cross the concrete floor in boots that had clearly seen better decades. Someone snickered about the truck parked outside, visible through the open hangar doors, its bed lined with mismatched tools instead of the polished equipment cases the internal team favored. Someone else made a comment, just loud enough to carry across the open space, about how the company must really be hurting for cash if this particular man was the best they could find on short notice. Nobody offered him a team. Nobody offered him equipment beyond the basics, already sitting in the hangar. Equipment that had clearly not been maintained with much care since the previous failed attempts at repair. They handed him a single set of blueprints, gestured vaguely at the wreck of a jet sitting under harsh fluorescent light, and walked away as if washing their hands of an embarrassment already in progress, eager to distance themselves from whatever happened next, so they could claim no responsibility either way. There was an unspoken assumption running underneath all of it, the kind people rarely said aloud but acted on constantly, that a black man showing up alone in worn-out clothes, with no entourage and no fanfare, no impressive title printed on a business card, could not possibly be the answer to a problem this expensive and this technically demanding. It showed in the way nobody made eye contact when he asked simple questions about prior maintenance records. It showed in the way junior staff hovered near the hangar entrance rather than the actual aircraft, treating distance from Marcus as a kind of insurance against being associated with an obvious mistake. Marcus did not argue with any of it, did not raise his voice or demand respect he knew words alone would never earn him in that room. He set down his single toolbox near the nose of the aircraft, walked the length of the fuselage once, slow and deliberate, his palm trailing along the cold metal, the way a doctor might press fingers along a patient's ribs, searching for something deeper than what the X-rays already showed. Then, without ceremony, he climbed inside and began. What followed over the next several days reshaped the quiet skepticism in that hangar into something closer to genuine, uneasy disbelief. Marcus began a systematic inspection that largely ignored the official damage report, treating it less as gospel and more as a starting suggestion written by people who had stopped looking the moment they found something convenient to blame. Where other engineers had scanned the obvious failure points and stopped, satisfied they had found their smoking gun, Marcus kept going, methodically, patiently, the way a man works when he has already decided he will not leave until he understands every inch of what he is dealing with. He traced the hydraulic lines inch by inch, running his fingers along fittings, checking pressure seals that had passed every prior inspection on paper, but had clearly never been physically tested by hand. He pulled access panels nobody else had bothered opening, panels that required removing layers of insulation and wiring conduit just to reach, work that took hours and yielded nothing visible to the naked eye until he brought out instruments calibrated to detect what eyes alone never could. He spent an entire afternoon with his head and shoulders buried inside the flight control assembly, emerging only to request a borescope camera that the junior engineers did not even know the hangar owned, a piece of equipment buried in a storage closet that nobody had touched in over a year. The senior staff grew impatient fast, the way people grow impatient with anything that threatens to prove them wrong by taking longer than their own assumptions allowed. A man named Greg, who carried himself like he ran the place, even though his title said otherwise, cornered Marcus on the third day and told him bluntly that he was wasting company time, chasing ghosts in a system that had already been thoroughly cleared by qualified professionals. Marcus looked up from the panel he was working on, wiped his hands slowly on a rag hanging from his belt, and said the kind of thing that tends to end an argument simply by being true and leaving nothing left to dispute. "The aircraft does not lie," he said. "People just do not want to listen to what it is telling them." Greg had no real answer for that, no comeback that did not sound defensive or foolish. So he simply walked away, muttering something about contractors who thought they knew everything better than the people who actually worked there full-time. By the end of the first week, Marcus had found what everyone else had missed entirely, and it was considerably worse than anyone in that distant boardroom wanted to hear. The failure had not originated where the official report claimed it had originated. It was not a simple, isolated engine malfunction, the kind of clean, containable story that insurance companies and press releases love because it requires no further explanation and implicates no past decisions. The real problem was structural. A fatigue crack hidden deep within a load-bearing support frame, a crack that had been patched rather than properly repaired years earlier during a previous maintenance cycle, long before this particular failure had ever taken place. Someone, at some point in this aircraft's history, had taken a shortcut to save time and money, signed the paperwork, claiming a full repair had been completed, and moved on to the next task, without ever knowing or caring that this shortcut would sit inside the aircraft like a slow-burning fuse, waiting patiently for the right combination of stress, vibration, and time to finally let go. Marcus had not simply found a fix for a recent accident. He had uncovered a buried mistake that predated his entire involvement by years, one that, if it ever became public, would embarrass a great many people who had signed off on inspections. They had apparently never actually performed with the rigor their signatures implied. From that point forward, Marcus barely left the hangar at all. He brought a cot and set it up in a quiet corner behind a row of storage racks. He brought a hot plate and a coffee maker that ran almost constantly. He called his sister and asked her to keep an eye on Olivia for a stretch longer than either of them would have preferred, explaining only that this job mattered more than most, that something about it felt important in a way he could not fully articulate yet. He settled into a rhythm that would stretch across 23 days, most of them 18 and 20-hour stretches, broken only by a few restless hours of sleep beneath the belly of the jet he was trying desperately to save, his body aching in ways that reminded him, increasingly, that he was no longer the young engineer who once pulled these kinds of hours without consequence. The work itself was almost unbelievable in its scope, once you understood what it actually required. Standard replacement parts for a fatigue crack this deep and this specific simply did not exist on any supplier's shelf, so Marcus fabricated custom reinforcement components entirely by hand, machining pieces to tolerances. Most commercial repair shops would have needed a full engineering team and a week of lead time to produce safely. He rebuilt entire sections of the support frame from raw stock, welding with a precision that drew a small, quiet crowd the first time the younger engineers caught him at it, sparks throwing long shadows across the hangar walls at 2 a.m, while Marcus worked without so much as glancing up to acknowledge the audience gathering near the doorway. He tore into the hydraulic system and rerouted lines that had been improperly installed years before, fixing a second hidden problem nobody had even thought to ask him about, simply because the aircraft itself had quietly insisted something there was also wrong. He recalibrated the flight control surfaces entirely by hand, testing and retesting with a patience that bordered on the monastic, refusing to declare any single system finished until he had personally verified its behavior under every condition he could simulate inside a grounded hangar. One person noticed all of it, really noticed, in a way that mattered far more than passive curiosity. Ethan Park, a junior engineer, barely 2 years out of school, had started the week mocking Marcus right alongside everyone else, more out of social survival than any genuine conviction that the older man deserved ridicule. But mockery is difficult to sustain in the steady presence of obvious competence, and somewhere around day 6, Ethan stopped laughing and started lingering near Marcus instead, drawn by something he could not quite name yet. He asked tentative questions at first, expecting to be brushed off or ignored, the way senior engineers usually treated junior ones who asked too much. Marcus, who had little patience for arrogance, but seemingly endless patience for genuine curiosity, started answering him, slowly at first, then with growing detail as he realized the boy was actually listening. By the second week, Ethan was handing Marcus tools before he even had to ask for them, holding work lights at precise angles during difficult inspections, staying late, not because anyone instructed him to, but because he had started to understand, with a kind of quiet awe, that he was watching something genuinely rare unfold in front of him. The other engineers thought Ethan was wasting his early career, attaching himself to a contractor nobody important seemed to respect or even properly acknowledge. Ethan stopped caring what they thought. Somewhere around the same time, he watched Marcus diagnose a developing problem purely from sound, just by listening to a system cycle through its motions, before any gauge or sensor had registered a single abnormal reading. On the 23rd day, Marcus made his final pass through the entire aircraft, running diagnostics one more time, checking torque values on fasteners he had already personally checked twice before, refusing to let exhaustion convince him that twice was good enough, when a third pass cost only a little more time and bought considerably more certainty. He stood alone in the cockpit a long while afterward, one hand resting lightly on the yoke, the way a craftsman lingers on a finished piece before finally letting it leave his hands and enter a world he can no longer fully control. Then he climbed down slowly, walked to the small folding table that had become his office for over 3 weeks, and began writing his final report by hand before transcribing it properly, because he wanted his own thoughts organized clearly before any lawyer or executive ever had the chance to twist them. The report Marcus eventually submitted was thorough, almost to the point of resembling a small technical book, documenting every defect found, every repair performed, every test conducted and passed, complete with photographs, precise measurements, and signatures certifying each completed phase of the work. According to the contract he had signed at the very beginning of this assignment, full completion of the repair, verified and documented to this exacting standard, entitled him to $250,000, a number that had seemed almost absurd to the Sky Vista accounting team, back when nobody truly believed the job was even possible to complete. Now that the job was actually done, sitting there in undeniable, working condition, that same number suddenly felt to certain executives less like a promise they had made, and more like a problem they needed to find a clever way around. The meeting where everything finally fell apart took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor of the Sky Vista headquarters building, the kind of room architecturally designed to make visitors feel small beneath its harsh fluorescent lighting and oversized table. Richard Collins sat at the head of that table, flanked by Sandra Hall and 2 members of the legal team nobody had bothered to introduce by name, their presence alone, signaling that this meeting had been carefully planned in advance. Marcus sat across from all of them with nothing but a thin folder containing his own copies of everything, the kind of quiet, contained posture that comes from a man who has learned through hard experience not to expect fairness, but who still shows up hoping for it anyway, against his own better judgment. Richard opened the conversation by congratulating Marcus on, in his exact words, an interesting effort, before pivoting almost immediately into the practiced language of doubt and deflection. "There is no clear evidence," he said, his tone almost reasonable, "that the majority of this work was actually performed by you personally, rather than by our existing internal engineering team, who were also present in the hangar throughout this entire period." It was a strange, slippery claim, technically not an outright lie, and entirely dishonest in spirit, since the internal team's only real contribution during those 23 days had been standing nearby, occasionally mocking the man doing the actual work, and filing the paperwork that recorded his progress. Sandra followed with the kind of cold, deliberate arithmetic that companies reach for when they have already decided not to pay, and are simply searching for a number small enough to dress up as generous. She suggested $5,000, framed delicately as a gesture of goodwill, rather than payment for services rendered under a signed contract, a stipend, she called it, for his time and personal effort. Someone seated at the far end of the table actually laughed out loud, a short, ugly sound that filled the entire room before anyone bothered to suppress it or apologize for it. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not slam the folder down onto the table or demand that someone read the original contract aloud, though he absolutely could have, and though every single clause in that contract would have supported him completely and without ambiguity. He simply set the folder down at the center of the table where everyone present could see it clearly, and he signed the handover documentation that formally transferred the completed aircraft back into Sky Vista's full custody, a transfer that, crucially and deliberately, did not include his final safety certification signature. The one document that legally confirmed the repair had passed his own personal verification as the engineer officially of record on this contract. Then he stood slowly, buttoned his jacket with calm, unhurried hands, and looked directly at Richard Collins with an expression that contained considerably more pity than anger. "I hope you understand exactly what you just refused," Marcus said quietly, and then he walked out of that glass-walled room without waiting for any response, because by then there was nothing left in that room worth waiting around to hear. Sky Vista, for its part, behaved in the days that followed as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Within a week, the company scheduled a press conference to announce the triumphant return of their flagship regional jet to active service, a carefully crafted story about resilience and engineering excellence that conveniently erased the name of the one man who had actually made any of it true. Reporters ran the story largely as written. Footage showing the gleaming aircraft rolled proudly out of the hangar, executives shaking hands enthusiastically in front of cameras, vague references scattered throughout to a highly skilled technical team that had worked tirelessly around the clock to restore the aircraft to full operational standards. Nobody in that press room thought to ask who, specifically, made up that team. Nobody thought to ask, until the pilots themselves started asking it instead, with considerably more persistence than any reporter had bothered to show. Airline pilots, as a matter of professional habit, do not take chances with their own carefully honed instincts, and the senior captains scheduled to fly that particular aircraft began reviewing its technical documentation the way they always did before any major return to service. Methodically, line by line, treating every page of paperwork with the same seriousness they treated their own pre-flight checklists. It did not take long for one of them to notice something genuinely strange buried within the file structure. Marcus Johnson's name appeared everywhere, throughout the technical documentation, attached to virtually every major repair entry, every structural modification, every hydraulic system correction listed in painstaking detail. And yet the single most important document in that entire file, the final airworthiness safety certification, the one page that was supposed to carry his signature confirming the aircraft was fully cleared for paying passenger service, was conspicuously, glaringly blank, where a signature should have been. Word moved through the pilot ranks, the way it always seems to move through a tightly knit profession, built on trust and shared mortal risk, quietly at first, traded between captains over coffee in the crew lounge, then less quietly, until it eventually reached Captain Daniel Brooks, a 22-year veteran with the kind of reputation that made younger pilots instinctively straighten their posture whenever he walked into a briefing room. Daniel pulled the complete file himself, rather than relying on second-hand summaries. He read through it twice, carefully, the way he read every official document concerning an aircraft he might be expected to fly. He noticed the exact same gap everyone else had already noticed, and unlike the executives upstairs who had decided that particular gap was merely a paperwork inconvenience to be quietly handled later through some administrative workaround, Daniel decided it was something else entirely. It was a warning, plain and unambiguous, and he had spent 2 decades in this profession learning never to ignore one. The morning the aircraft was finally scheduled for its first commercial flight back into active service, the gate area buzzed with the low, familiar hum of a routine departure, families settling comfortably into their seats, flight attendants running their final checks with practiced efficiency. Nothing on the surface suggesting anything unusual was about to unfold. Daniel Brooks stood firmly at the cockpit door instead of boarding as expected, arms crossed deliberately, and told the assembled ground crew, in plain and unmistakable language, that he would not be taking this particular aircraft up that morning. When pressed for an explanation by a visibly irritated operations manager, who clearly believed this would be a quick problem to resolve, his answer was simple, calm, and absolute. The person legally responsible for certifying this repair as fully complete has not signed off on it, he said, his voice carrying easily through the gate area. Until that signature physically exists on this paperwork, this aircraft does not fly with me sitting at the controls. The response from Sky Vista's operations leadership was immediate and visibly furious. Calls were placed urgently up the chain within minutes. Executives summoned hastily from their offices to handle what they assumed would be a quick, simple problem, perhaps a stubborn pilot who simply needed reassurance. Maybe a phone call from someone senior enough in the organization to smooth the entire situation over before it caused any real delay. Daniel remained completely unmoved by any of it. When a visibly frustrated regional director tried to explain patiently that the missing signature was merely a technicality, that the company's own internal team had already reviewed the work thoroughly and considered it entirely sound, Daniel delivered the line that would echo through every conversation that followed for days afterward across the entire airline. I carry 180 lives onto that aircraft every single time I fly it, he said. I am not betting their safety on someone's confidence. I am betting it on verification. And right now, verification simply does not exist on this paperwork, no matter how many people in suits tell me otherwise. The flight was delayed once. Then it was delayed a second time. By mid-afternoon, word had spread rapidly through the crew lounges and break rooms scattered across the airport that the morning flight crew had refused to take the aircraft, and the precise reasoning behind that refusal traveled along with it, gaining additional detail and conviction with every fresh retelling among colleagues who trusted each other's judgment far more than they trusted anything coming out of the corporate office. What happened next unfolded with the steady, inevitable momentum of dominoes falling one after another in a closed room. A second flight crew, scheduled for an afternoon rotation on that same aircraft, reviewed the identical documentation and arrived independently at the exact same conclusion Daniel Brooks had reached hours earlier. They refused as well, citing the same missing certification, the same unease that no amount of corporate reassurance could quiet. By evening, a third crew followed suit, and by that point the pattern was undeniable to everyone watching. The pilots' union, an organization that did not typically involve itself lightly in operational disputes between management and individual crews, sent representatives directly to the airport within hours of that third refusal, recognizing immediately that this was no longer some isolated incident involving an overly cautious captain, but the early stages of something the company could not simply wait out or quietly manage away. It was around this point that Ethan Park decided silence was no longer something he could continue justifying to himself, no matter how junior his position or how much trouble speaking up might bring him personally. He had watched Marcus Johnson work nearly every single day for 23 consecutive days. He had handed him tools, held lights at countless awkward angles, learned more about practical aircraft engineering in 3 weeks than he had absorbed in 2 full years of formal schooling, and he knew, with absolute settled certainty, exactly whose hands had actually saved that jet from the scrap heap. Ethan went directly to the union representatives, deliberately bypassing his own management chain entirely, and told them everything he knew without hesitation. The internal team's actual contribution to the repair, he explained plainly, had been minimal at best, largely limited to basic supervision and routine paperwork filing throughout the entire process. Roughly 90% of the substantive engineering work, the diagnosis, the custom fabrication, the precision welding, the painstaking recalibration had been performed personally by Marcus Johnson, working almost entirely alone for over 3 weeks. Once that information reached people positioned outside the small, controlled circle of executives who had been carefully managing the public story, containment became completely impossible. Internal emails, the kind that companies always assume will never see daylight outside their own servers, began circulating quietly among union representatives, and eventually found their way into the hands of an aviation industry journalist who had already been following, with growing curiosity, the strange story of an airline crew that had refused, en masse, to fly a freshly repaired aircraft. The emails painted a deeply unflattering picture, candid exchanges between Richard Collins and Sandra Hall, discussing privately how best to attribute the repair publicly to their own internal engineering department, rather than to an outside contractor whose contracted fee, in their own internal language, represented an unnecessary and entirely avoidable cost to the company's bottom line. The story broke publicly within 48 hours of that third pilot refusal, and once it broke, it did not remain contained to aviation trade publications and industry newsletters. It became the kind of story that traveled rapidly, the kind ordinary people without any aviation background suddenly found themselves discussing with genuine outrage. Public reaction arrived fast, and it arrived furious. People who had never previously thought about aircraft maintenance contracts in their entire lives suddenly held strong, passionate opinions about a company that had apparently tried to cheat the very man who had single-handedly saved an $80 million aircraft and, by extension, every single passenger who would eventually fly aboard it. The unfairness embedded in the story carried its own undeniable gravity. A skilled man dismissed for his appearance, mocked openly by people far less capable than himself, and then denied fair payment for work that quite literally kept other human beings alive thousands of feet in the air. It did not take long for that mounting public anger to demand an actual independent investigation rather than accept the company's increasingly hollow, self-serious denials, and SkyVista's board, facing mounting pressure simultaneously from regulators, anxious shareholders, and an increasingly hostile media cycle that showed no signs of slowing down, finally authorized a fully independent review of the entire matter. What that investigation eventually uncovered went well beyond a simple payment dispute between a contractor and a corporation. Investigators confirmed, through detailed documentation, precise timestamps, and candid witness statements from hangar staff who had genuinely nothing left to lose by finally being honest, that Marcus had indeed performed the overwhelming majority of the technical work himself, and that SkyVista's leadership had been fully aware of this reality from a very early point in the entire process. The decision to withhold his rightful payment had never been a simple misunderstanding about relative contribution. It had been a calculated, deliberate choice, an attempt to publicly credit the internal engineering department for a repair they had largely only watched happen from a safe distance, while quietly minimizing or outright eliminating the substantial sum owed to the outside contractor who had actually performed nearly all of the genuinely difficult and dangerous work involved. The investigation also surfaced something nobody at SkyVista had apparently bothered researching before deciding to treat Marcus as easily disposable labor. Long before he became a quiet, low-profile contractor doing skilled work that most companies routinely undervalued, Marcus Johnson had spent over a decade contributing directly to advanced aviation systems used in sophisticated military aircraft, work that had earned him serious classified commendations and a quiet reputation within certain specialized circles as one of the most technically gifted structural engineers of his entire generation. Several major aerospace firms had attempted, repeatedly over the years, to recruit him into permanent, well-compensated positions. He had turned every single offer down, without much hesitation, consistently preferring his hard-won independence and a flexible schedule that allowed him to raise his daughter properly without answering to a rigid corporate ladder he had genuinely no interest in climbing in the first place. That remarkable reputation came fully into public view when a retired admiral, a man who had once overseen aircraft readiness for an entire naval air wing, and who had crossed paths professionally with Marcus's earlier military work years before, agreed to speak openly with the investigating journalist about what he personally knew. His statement, when it finally landed publicly, carried the kind of unquestionable authority that silenced lingering doubt almost instantly. If Marcus Johnson says an aircraft is safe, the admiral stated plainly, then it is safe, full stop. And if Marcus Johnson has not personally signed off on it, I would not set foot on that particular plane myself, and I would strongly advise no one else to either, regardless of what any corporate press release claims to the contrary. That single, powerful statement, repeated across every news outlet now actively covering the unfolding story, completely transformed public perception of the entire situation. This was no longer simply a disgruntled contractor's dispute over an unpaid invoice. This was now a deeply credentialed expert, openly vouched for by serious people carrying serious credentials who had been mocked, systematically undervalued, and then deliberately cheated by a company seemingly more concerned with internal credit and cost savings than with telling the basic truth to its own passengers. The fallout inside SkyVista arrived with the kind of speed companies usually reserve only for genuine existential emergencies. Shareholders, watching headline after headline directly connect their airline to serious allegations of exploiting a skilled black engineer, while simultaneously putting passenger safety at unnecessary risk purely to save money, reacted with the kind of swift, punishing sell-off that erases substantial market value in mere hours rather than the usual months. The stock price dropped sharply within a single chaotic trading day, prompting an emergency session of the full board of directors that ran late into the night and well past anyone's comfortable bedtime. By the following morning, both Richard Collins and Sandra Hall had been formally placed on administrative leave pending further internal review, a familiar corporate euphemism for an ending that everyone seated in that boardroom understood perfectly well, without needing it spelled out any further. Legal counsel began urgently preparing for the very real possibility of shareholder litigation, significant regulatory penalties, and a formal wrongful business practices investigation that threatened consequences extending well beyond a single unpaid invoice and a single embarrassing press cycle. It was the newly appointed interim leadership team, scrambling to manage a full-blown crisis they had personally inherited rather than created, who finally reached out to Marcus directly with something resembling genuine humility. The conversation, when it finally happened, was nothing whatsoever like the dismissive, cruel meeting that had taken place weeks earlier in that same glass-walled room. There was no laughter anywhere in this conversation. There was a careful, lawyer-reviewed apology, an offer of immediate and complete payment, and a formal acknowledgement that the company's prior treatment of him had been, in their own chosen language, deeply inappropriate and entirely inconsistent with their stated corporate values. Marcus listened patiently to all of it, without once interrupting. And then, for the first time since this entire painful ordeal had begun weeks earlier, he made them wait. He did not sign anything that particular day. He told them plainly that he needed time to genuinely consider what real accountability actually looked like in practice, because an apology delivered only after public exposure had forced their hand was simply not the same thing as authentic remorse, and he fully intended to make sure that important difference mattered before agreeing to anything further with this company. The new leadership team that ultimately took the reins at Sky Vista in the difficult weeks that followed moved with a speed and apparent sincerity that stood in stark, almost jarring contrast to everything that had come immediately before. The full $250,000 originally owed under the signed contract was paid out in its complete entirety, along with an additional, substantial settlement, specifically acknowledging the considerable harm caused by weeks of sustained public humiliation and blatant professional disrespect. The company issued a formal public apology, delivered not through some brief, carefully worded statement quietly buried somewhere on a corporate website, but through an actual, fully attended press conference, covered by the same journalists who had spent the preceding weeks meticulously documenting every detail of the company's repeated failures and dishonesty. The most striking moment of this entire resolution, however, did not happen inside any boardroom or in front of any press podium at all. It happened directly on the airport tarmac itself, where Sky Vista organized a public gathering specifically meant to mark the aircraft's true, honest return to active service, this time with complete transparency about exactly who had actually saved it from total ruin. More than 100 pilots showed up that particular day, many of them entirely off-duty, with no operational reason whatsoever to be present, simply wanting to stand together as witnesses to something they personally considered genuinely important. Daniel Brooks stepped forward to speak, on behalf of all of them gathered there, his clear, steady voice carrying easily across the open tarmac without any need for amplification or assistance. We did not refuse to fly that particular aircraft because we ever doubted the underlying engineering, Daniel said to the assembled crowd. We refused because the one man who actually saved it, who poured 3 exhausting weeks of his own life into making absolutely certain that every single person who ever boarded that plane would come home safely to their families, was treated as though he simply did not matter at all. We will not quietly pretend that kind of treatment is acceptable. Not for him, and not for anyone else who comes after him in this profession. Marcus stood quietly near the edge of that gathered crowd, Olivia's small hand held firmly in his own, listening carefully to a captain he had genuinely never personally met before describe exactly what had happened to him, with more clarity and heartfelt conviction than Marcus himself had ever once bothered, demanding from anyone. When the proper moment finally came, he stepped forward calmly, accepted the documentation, finally extended to him, with the basic respect it always should have carried from the very beginning, and signed his final certification, the single signature that had ultimately triggered an entire industry's painful reckoning simply by being deliberately withheld for so long. The aircraft taxied out shortly afterward, its engines spooling up with the low, building roar that anyone who has ever stood near an active runway instantly recognizes, and lifted cleanly into a pale blue morning sky, while more than 100 assembled pilots and a small crowd of airport staff watched its steady ascent in respectful silence. Ethan stood beside Marcus throughout the entire climb, his eyes following the jet closely until it gradually became a small, steady shape disappearing against distant clouds. Was it worth it? He finally asked quietly, the same question everyone watching that morning probably wanted answered for themselves. Marcus did not look away from the sky as he gave his answer. It was never really about the money, he said simply. It was about whether people still remembered that honesty carries a real price, and whether they were finally willing to pay that price when it actually mattered most. Today, they finally did, and that matters more than any number on a contract ever could. Talent ignored does not simply disappear into the silence that surrounds it. It waits, patiently and quietly, for the precise moment when truth refuses to stay grounded any longer. And when that moment finally arrives, it always finds its own way back into the open sky, exactly where it belonged from the very beginning.